I told you this would happen. It's your mess.
Don't you dare put this on me.
Excuse me, gentlemen. Perhaps I can assist you. I understand your concern, Mr. Harrison, but as the menu states, the corkage fee applies to all outside vintages. We did clarify this when you arrived.
The hum of the restaurant buzzed around Thomas like the unimportant noise it had become. He had long since learned how to ignore the small distractions in the world, the chime of the doorbell, the clink of silverware, the rustling of napkins. But the waitress, Sofia, she didn't disappear into the background like the others. Not for him. Not tonight. Her name tag glittered beneath the dim lights, a gentle reminder of her humanity, a subtle hint that he had the power to erase her existence with a few careless words. And he had. He always did. She approached the table with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times, but tonight, he noticed the tiny tremor in her hand as she placed his drink on the table. Thomas smirked. "You know, I didn't ask for this much attitude in my drink, sweetheart." Her eyes flashed, a silent warning, but she held herself steady. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll make sure it's correct." But it wasn't the drink. It was her. The way she looked at him. The way her eyes darkened when he spoke. His lips curled into a mocking grin, and before he could stop himself, the words were out. "Maybe if you stopped acting like you own the place, you'd get better tips." Silence. The other patrons continued to talk and laugh, unaware, or perhaps uncaring, of the stinging words that had just cut through the air. But Sofia's face shifted. Her jaw tightened. The smile she'd been wearing melted away, replaced by something colder, more dangerous. The room seemed to hold its breath. She didn't respond immediately. But the look in her eyes, it told him everything. The game had changed. The hum of the restaurant buzzed around Thomas like the unimportant noise it had become. It was a familiar place, one he frequented on business lunches and solo dinners, a quiet corner where he could escape the mess of his day. But tonight everything felt different. Sofia, the waitress, approached with a practiced smile, her dark skin glowing under the dim lights. She placed the glass of wine in front of him, her fingers brushing the edge of the crystal. He barely noticed her until she was close enough to catch his attention, but when she did, something about her demeanor caught him off guard. The way she was too careful with her movements, too precise in her service. Felt calculated. "Is there anything else I can get for you, sir?" she asked, her voice soft but carrying an undertone of something he couldn't quite place. Thomas watched her for a beat longer than necessary, examining the way she stood, the way her eyes held his gaze just a moment too long. The delicate tension in the air was only amplified by the subtle clink of the silverware and the low chatter of other diners around them. It was as if he were in a different world altogether, one where he could control the mood, the conversation, the space. But she was the one who held the power now. "No, this is fine," Thomas said, offering a half-hearted smile. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, trying to dismiss the discomfort that lingered in his chest. "But, you really should smile more. A little bit of customer service goes a long way." Sofia's smile faltered for just a moment, but she quickly regained composure. Her hands, though still steady, seemed to tighten slightly around the tray she was holding. "Is there anything else I can do to improve your experience?" she asked again, but this time her words felt almost rehearsed. There was no warmth in them. Thomas leaned forward, his voice lowering as he took in the quietness of the room. "Actually, you could stop acting like you own the place. It's kind of off-putting when someone tries to play it so perfect." For a split second, Sofia's expression tightened, her jaw clenching ever so slightly. But she said nothing. She just stood there, staring at him. For the first time, Thomas could see the conflict in her eyes, the flicker of something deeper, something more dangerous than just a frustrated waitress. It unsettled him, though he would never admit it. "Of course, sir," she said, finally turning to walk away, her pace slow, controlled, as though she were purposefully putting distance between them. But the tension in the air hadn't dissipated. It had only intensified. Thomas watched her retreat, unsure of what had just transpired. He was used to being in control, used to dominating every interaction, yet Sofia's response, or lack of response, lingered in his mind. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just a bad night for her. People had bad days, right? The thought didn't settle. And even as he tried to push it away, the weight of it settled somewhere deep within his gut, gnawing at him. He took another sip of his wine, trying to wash away the uncomfortable feeling, but it didn't work. He knew that something had shifted, but what exactly he couldn't put his finger on. That night, after leaving the restaurant, Thomas tried to shake the feeling. He even called his buddy Mark to vent, speaking about the waitress and how she couldn't take a joke. How sensitive people were these days. He expected Mark to laugh it off, but instead, there was silence on the other end of the line, a pause too long for comfort. "Thomas, man. Maybe you went a bit too far with that," Mark said, his voice hesitant. "You don't know what she's going through." The words struck harder than any punch. For a moment, Thomas felt his breath catch in his chest. He scoffed, dismissing the thought. "It's just a waitress," he told himself. "She didn't take it the way I meant it. I didn't even say anything that bad." But as the night wore on, it was all he could think about. He could still see the way Sofia's face had hardened, the coldness in her eyes. She'd been too professional, he thought. That's all it was. Nothing to get worked up about. Yet the discomfort festered. The next day, Sofia returned to work, the sting of the interaction still fresh. She had learned long ago how to smile through the pain, how to bear the weight of other people's biases without showing her frustration. But this time something felt different. She hadn't expected the words to hurt. They always do, she reminded herself. But there was something about Thomas's attitude that had stung deeper than usual. Maybe it was the look on his face when he spoke, as if she was beneath him, an object to be dismissed, a thing to be belittled. It wasn't even the words themselves. It was the way he had said them, like it was just another game for him. As she cleared a table later that night, she overheard a conversation between two of her co-workers, chuckling at some joke that barely registered in her mind. But then one of them let something slip. "Man, I feel bad for that waitress. How do you stay so nice when they talk to you like that?" Sofia froze. She wasn't sure if it was a casual observation or a whispered joke at her expense, but the weight of it felt suffocating. Meanwhile, Thomas found himself in a series of odd situations. He hadn't realized how much his words, his behavior, his dismissal of people had been a part of his everyday life. At work, his colleagues teased him subtly. "You sure your servers aren't too good at their jobs, Thomas?" one of them asked, a sly smile on his face. Another time, a well-meaning friend asked if he had tried to get his tip game up with the staff. Thomas laughed along, but the unease didn't leave. Something about the way they said it made him feel exposed, as though his casual prejudice had become more obvious than he'd thought. Sofia, on the other hand, was beginning to lose her patience. The taunts and the microaggressions were one thing, but Thomas's particular brand of dismissal gnawed at her in a way she couldn't ignore. He was a regular, a repeat offender in a world where people like her were invisible until it was time to serve them. But she had learned to use silence as her weapon. She would wait for the right moment, and it would come soon enough. The moment she'd been waiting for was fast approaching, and it would change everything. The following week, Thomas couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over him after his encounter with Sofia. It wasn't just about her, it was about everything. At work, his colleagues had begun to notice his odd behavior. Where once he had been charming and smooth in his interactions, he now found himself fumbling for the right words. He had always been the guy who could manipulate a conversation, twist a situation to his advantage, but now it was like he was walking on eggshells. His co-workers had noticed, and they were starting to call him out on it. Jokingly, of course. "You okay, Thomas?" his co-worker Gary asked one afternoon, watching him absent-mindedly stir his coffee. "You've been awfully quiet lately. You finally feeling guilty about something?" Thomas tried to laugh it off, shaking his head. "Nah, just a little tired. You know how it is." But the words felt hollow coming out of his mouth. He had always been able to command attention in a room, but now, for some reason, the attention made him feel exposed. Gary, sensing his discomfort, continued. You sure? You've been off, man. It's like you got a secret or something. A guilty conscience, maybe. He chuckled, but there was an edge to his voice that Thomas couldn't ignore. You're reading too much into it, Thomas replied, forcing a smile, but his mind was elsewhere, swirling back to the encounter with Sofia. Sofia, meanwhile, had no such luxury of avoiding the issue. Every day that passed, the weight of what had happened, of what was happening, pressed down on her. She had come to terms with the fact that she would always be subject to someone's biased opinion, someone's unfair judgment. It had been that way her whole life, but that didn't make it any easier to swallow. The real problem wasn't just the customers. It wasn't just the rude comments from people like Thomas who thought they could talk down to her because of the color of her skin. It was the system. The subtle, insidious ways the restaurant's management had been complicit in the degradation of employees like her. The backhanded comments from her colleagues, the way they looked at her when she was forced to smile through their prejudice. It wasn't just the words. It was the silence, the constant microaggressions, the refusal to acknowledge that something was wrong in the first place. She had made up her mind. She couldn't just let it slide anymore. One afternoon, as she was wiping down a table, one of her co-workers, Lisa, caught her eye. Lisa was new, a young woman who had moved from the small town upstate to start fresh. Sofia had always seen the quiet hope in Lisa's eyes, but there was something else now, a quiet sadness that hadn't been there before. You've been so quiet, Sofia, Lisa said softly, glancing around as though to ensure no one could overhear. Is everything okay? Sofia hesitated, wiping her hands on her apron. Yeah, just tired, she said, but the lie tasted bitter in her mouth. The truth was, she was tired of pretending. Tired of constantly being asked to smile, to serve, to accept what was being done to her and her community. Tired of being invisible, ignored, and then dismissed when she did speak out. I saw how he treated you last week, Lisa continued. Thomas, right? Sofia froze for a moment. She didn't know if she was ready to talk about it, not like this. But Lisa was watching her, her eyes filled with concern. It wasn't just him, Sofia said finally. It's a lot of people. Everything. It's the way they look at me, the way they talk to me, like I'm less than. Lisa nodded, her expression turning sympathetic. I've noticed it too. The way they talk to you, the way you're treated here. Sofia's eyes flickered with a mix of frustration and resolve. She had been waiting for someone to say it out loud, but hearing it spoken in such a quiet, sincere voice made her heart ache in a way she hadn't anticipated. You're not alone in this, Lisa added softly. Maybe it's time we did something about it. For a moment, Sofia felt the full weight of what she had been carrying, the anger, the exhaustion, the defeat. And then, beneath all of that, a spark of something else. Something she hadn't realized was there. Oh. She nodded slowly. Maybe you're right, she whispered. That evening, Sofia walked home after her shift, the cool night air washing over her as she tried to make sense of the conversation. Lisa's words echoed in her mind, a reminder that she didn't have to suffer in silence. There were people who saw her, who understood the weight she carried. Maybe it was time to speak up. Maybe it was time to make it known that this wasn't just some passing discomfort, some momentary conflict. But as she walked, the doubt crept in. She had seen how people reacted to others who spoke out. The backlash, the ridicule, the attempts to silence. The system was designed to crush people like her, to make them invisible, to make them feel powerless. Yet something in Sofia had shifted. She had been silent for too long, accepting the way things were, always afraid to rock the boat. Now, as she walked beneath the flickering streetlights, she realized that silence wasn't the solution anymore. It was time for the world to know the truth. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew that things couldn't go on like this. It wasn't just about Thomas anymore. It was about something bigger. A shift, a change that needed to happen, one that would cost her more than she could ever imagine. As for Thomas, he found himself increasingly distracted, consumed by the memory of Sofia's cold, unwavering stare. It didn't make sense to him. He had made his usual comment, had dismissed it, but she had responded differently. She had said nothing, but it was the silence that had bothered him the most. He didn't know why it bothered him. He wasn't the kind of person who worried about a single insult. But there was something about Sofia, her poise, her strength, her ability to hold herself with such dignity, that unsettled him. The words he had spoken, casual as they had been, had changed things. Maybe he wasn't ready to face it yet, but he would have to sooner or later. Because it was clear now. Nothing between them would ever be the same again. The days after the encounter with Sofia felt like walking through fog for Thomas. Every conversation at work, every casual exchange, seemed to carry an undercurrent he couldn't quite name, an unease that gnawed at him, growing heavier with each passing moment. It was as though the entire world had shifted and he had failed to notice. He'd always been able to hide behind his charm, his confidence, but now he couldn't escape the feeling that he was being watched. And he hated it. At the office, Thomas found himself avoiding certain colleagues. It wasn't just about the casual jokes anymore. It was the way they looked at him when they thought he wasn't paying attention. A subtle shift in their expressions, a fleeting glance when his back was turned. He caught their eyes more than once, sensing their judgment, but when he tried to bring it up, they just laughed it off. "You all right, man?" Gary asked one morning as they grabbed coffee. "You've been off lately. Like really off. You sure you don't want to talk about it?" Thomas shot him a tight smile. "Nah, it's just been a long week. Nothing to worry about." But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't true. It wasn't just a long week. It was something deeper. Something uncomfortable. Something he wasn't ready to face. Sofia's world, meanwhile, had taken on an entirely different rhythm. It wasn't that she hadn't faced the usual challenges before, she had. Microaggressions, rude customers, the constant low-level racism that was so embedded in her life, it had almost become invisible. But what had happened with Thomas? That had been different. It wasn't just the words. It was the way they had hung in the air, the way they had cut through the typical noise of the restaurant. Felt personal. It felt like more than just another interaction with an ignorant customer. She couldn't shake it. Every time she walked into the restaurant, she could feel his presence lingering in her thoughts. She thought about his eyes, the way they had glanced at her, like she was less than him, like she was just a thing to be dismissed. But she couldn't let herself dwell on it. Sofia had always known the truth, that in this world she had to be twice as good to get half the recognition. The subtle prejudice, the systemic inequities, had been there her whole life. But with the encounter with Thomas, something had broken open inside her. A line had been crossed, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't want to let it slide. That night, Sofia sat at her small kitchen table, scrolling through her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen as she tried to work up the courage to send the email she had been drafting for days. An email to the restaurant's management. It was one thing to quietly tolerate the ignorance of customers. But this had gone too far. She had always been taught to keep her head down, to smile, to let things go. But something was changing inside her. The words that Thomas had flung at her were like a wake-up call. A reminder that there were systems in place that allowed people like him to thrive while people like her were left to clean up the mess. The email wasn't just a complaint about his behavior. No, Sofia was going bigger than that. She was detailing everything. The microaggressions, the tone-deaf comments, the ways the management turned a blind eye. She wasn't just writing about Thomas. She was writing about everything that had led to that moment. When she finally pressed send, she felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was quickly followed by a heavy weight. What if this didn't work? What if it all backfired? What if she lost her job for speaking up? But Sofia knew something had to change. And if it wasn't going to be Thomas, it had to be her. The next few days passed in a blur for both of them. Thomas, despite his discomfort, tried to go back to his usual routine. He attended meetings, engaged in conversations, but none of it felt as effortless as it once had. In the mirror, he could see the strain in his face, the shadows under his eyes. He was tired, restless. He knew something had changed. And then one afternoon the email arrived. Sofia had been right. Thomas didn't expect it. He didn't expect anything to come of it, really. He had forgotten about her complaint, brushed it off like another customer's gripe. But when he opened the email from his manager, his stomach turned. "We have received a formal complaint regarding your behavior toward one of our employees. The incident in question has been escalated for review. Please be advised that this is being treated as a serious matter and further actions may be taken. A meeting has been scheduled to discuss the details." For a long moment he just stared at the screen. His hands felt numb and his throat tightened. It was like the world had just tilted on its axis. He closed the email and opened another, trying to refocus. But the words on the screen were a blur. Nothing seemed to make sense anymore. Was it really that bad? He hadn't meant to hurt anyone, had he? But there was no escaping it. His actions had consequences, and now they were coming back to haunt him. Sofia, on the other hand, felt like the weight of the world had been lifted, even as she braced for what was to come. When she had sent that email, she had feared the worst. Losing her job, being ostracized by her coworkers, facing retaliation from management. But she had taken a step toward something bigger. The truth was out there now, in black and white. And she wasn't going to back down. That night, as she lay in bed, Sofia felt a quiet satisfaction. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. She had done something. She had taken action. And that was something she could be proud of, no matter what happened next. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was in control of her own story. And nothing, not even Thomas, could take that away from her. The days following the email were a whirlwind of tension and anticipation. Sofia didn't know what to expect, but she certainly wasn't expecting this. By the time she walked into the restaurant for her shift the following week, it was clear that something had shifted. The atmosphere, once warm and bustling with the sounds of clinking plates and light chatter, now felt heavy. There were whispered conversations behind her back, glances exchanged when she walked by. Sofia's stomach tightened as she realized that her email had sent ripples through the restaurant, ripples that had now reached her coworkers. She hadn't heard anything from management yet, but it was only a matter of time. She could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her, especially her supervisor, Carl, who had always been polite but distant. Today he barely looked her way. And then, there was the uncomfortable silence whenever Thomas came in. The moment he walked through the door, Sofia could feel the tension in the room spike. It wasn't just her anymore. It was everyone. Thomas had no idea how to act around her, and it showed. He'd barely made eye contact the last time he was in, looking down at his phone, feigning disinterest. But Sofia could see the nervous energy around him, the way he avoided her, the way he pretended she didn't exist. But she was there. And so was the truth. Thomas wasn't sure what he was expecting when he got the email from his boss. He thought maybe they'd sweep it under the rug, maybe a little slap on the wrist, and that would be the end of it. But no, they were taking this seriously. He had to attend a meeting with the head of HR and the restaurant manager to discuss the incident. He could feel the weight of the email in his chest every time he thought about it. A formal complaint, those words haunted him. It was the first time in his life that he had felt like his actions had consequences, like he couldn't just laugh something off or smooth it over with charm. He wasn't used to being scrutinized, not like this. When the meeting finally came, Thomas tried to prepare himself. He had run through what he would say, how he could explain himself, how he could make it seem like he wasn't the villain. But when he entered the HR office, sitting across from his boss and the HR manager, he realized just how little control he had over the situation. "I'm sure you're aware of the complaint," Carl said, his voice flat. "It's a serious matter. We don't take these kinds of allegations lightly." Thomas nodded, but inside his mind was racing. The words he had said to Sofia were now being dissected in front of him, being weighed and analyzed like they were something of importance. In his head, they had just been words. But now they were about to cost him. And the worst part. He had no idea what Sofia's version of the story was, what she had said in her email. The uncertainty gnawed at him. I didn't mean any harm, Thomas said quickly, trying to defend himself. It was just a joke. You know, I didn't think it would come across like that. I didn't mean to upset her. Carl raised an eyebrow, his gaze steady. It's not about intent, Thomas. It's about impact. We need to understand how your behavior made Sofia feel. There was a pause as the HR manager, a woman named Nancy, flipped through the report. Sofia has filed a formal complaint. She's detailing your interaction with her last week and how it made her feel uncomfortable, disrespected. She's even mentioned that this isn't an isolated incident. This is a pattern of behavior. Thomas's chest tightened. His palms were sweating. This isn't how I thought it would go down, he thought. He had underestimated how seriously his words would be taken. But as much as he wanted to fight back to justify himself, something about the room, the way Carl and Nancy were looking at him, made him hesitate. This wasn't a situation where he could talk his way out of it. There were no easy excuses anymore. You don't have a history of such complaints, but this behavior is unacceptable, Nancy said, her voice firm. We need to find a way to address it. We're considering a training program for all staff members to address microaggressions and inappropriate behavior. But we need to hear from you, Thomas. We need to know that you understand the problem here. His stomach churned. He nodded, but even to himself, the apology felt hollow. He had always prided himself on being able to navigate difficult situations with ease, but this was different. He couldn't charm his way out of this. He had hurt someone and now it was out in the open. And worst of all, it wasn't just Sofia. It was the system. The entire restaurant was now a part of this conversation. His actions had stirred up something larger than he could have imagined. Sofia, meanwhile, felt a quiet sense of satisfaction when she learned that the restaurant was taking her complaints seriously. She had never expected to be in this position, to be the one causing this kind of disruption. But she didn't regret it. Not for a second. The meeting between Thomas and management was a turning point for her too. She wasn't naive enough to believe that things would change overnight. The system wasn't going to just crumble because of a single email. But Sofia had made a statement. She had forced the people in power to reckon with the ugliness of the culture they had allowed to fester. And now, she was going to make sure that her voice was heard. She had no intention of letting this go. But as the days passed, Sofia started to notice something else. The quiet support she had begun to receive from some of her co-workers. Lisa, especially, was starting to ask questions about how things were run, about how they could make a difference. And even Carl, the supervisor who had always been a bit distant, seemed to be taking a new approach. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give Sofia hope. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had been silenced, every person who had been dismissed or belittled. And this was only the beginning. Thomas's world was beginning to collapse. He had thought he could keep skating by, keep pretending his actions didn't matter. But now the consequences were real. And he was finally starting to realize that the power he had always wielded so carelessly wasn't as absolute as he had once believed. As he walked out of the HR office, his heart heavy, his mind spinning, he understood one thing with terrifying clarity. His life was changing, and he had no idea what it would look like on the other side. Sofia was still at the restaurant when the storm began. The first sign that things were escalating came with a quiet phone call from Lisa, just before her evening shift. "Sofia," Lisa whispered, "I just heard. It's all over the company now." The words hit Sofia like a punch to the gut. She hadn't expected things to move this fast, but the ripple effect was already taking shape. News of the complaint had spread from the restaurant to corporate, and it wasn't long before it found its way into the local media. It wasn't just a small issue anymore. It was turning into a spectacle. "Why didn't you tell me it was going this far?" Lisa continued, her voice tinged with concern. "They're talking about you and Thomas at the office now. People are already taking sides." Sofia's mind spun as she tried to process what Lisa was saying. She had known that by making her complaint public, There would be consequences. She had braced herself for them. But hearing the news being spoken aloud, hearing it become something larger than just her experience, made her stomach twist. She was no longer just a waitress. She was the face of something bigger. "Just focus on keeping yourself safe, Sofia," Lisa said before hanging up. "We've got your back here." But as the day unfolded, the media buzz began. A local news station aired a segment about workplace harassment and microaggressions. And in a flash, Sofia found herself as the centerpiece of a story she never wanted to be part of. Her name was in headlines, alongside the words racism and abuse of power. She hadn't anticipated this. The sudden exposure, the intense scrutiny. The restaurant's PR team scrambled to contain the fallout, issuing a public statement that, in the eyes of many, felt more like damage control than an apology. Sofia felt the sting of it all as she stood in the break room, watching her co-workers gather around their phones, murmuring about the situation. She could hear the whispers of judgment, but this time they didn't sting as much. She had done what she had to do. Her voice had been heard. But it wasn't just her anymore. The story was spiraling beyond her control. She began to understand what it meant to be a part of something much bigger, to be a part of the conversation that others were too afraid to have. Meanwhile, Thomas was caught in a whirlwind of his own. The moment the news hit, his life changed in ways he couldn't predict. His co-workers at the office weren't laughing anymore. Their once casual jabs now felt loaded with meaning. Every time he passed by a colleague, he could feel their gaze lingering longer than usual. Some were sympathetic, but others were cold, distant. He knew it wasn't just about the waitress anymore. It was about him and his privilege. But the real storm began when his boss, Carl, called him into his office the next morning. Thomas stood in front of the desk, feeling smaller than he had ever felt in his life. The weight of Carl's silence was heavier than any reprimand he had ever received. "I don't need to remind you, Thomas, that this is a serious matter," Carl said quietly, his voice stern. "The company is facing public scrutiny because of what happened. We're getting calls from the press, people are starting to dig into your past, and we have to address this publicly. Our reputation is on the line." Thomas's heart raced. He could hear the sharpness in Carl's words, the finality in his tone. He had underestimated how far-reaching his actions would be. It wasn't just the restaurant anymore. It was his job, his career, everything he had worked for. "Look," Carl continued, his eyes narrowing, "you've been with this company for years. But I can't let this slide. We have a duty to uphold basic standards of conduct. And right now, the way you've handled this is making everything worse." Thomas felt his throat tighten. He wanted to protest, to defend himself, but the words stuck in his mouth. "It's just a joke," he wanted to say. "I didn't mean it like that." But the words felt hollow in the face of the public scrutiny, in the face of the very real consequences of his behavior. Carl leaned forward, his voice dropping. "We're placing you on leave until we can figure out the next steps. You'll need to issue an apology to the press and to Sofia. I'm giving you some time to reflect, Thomas. This isn't just about you anymore." For Sofia, the storm was beginning to feel less like a personal battle and more like a societal one. She had always known that people would push back when they were forced to confront their biases. But the media exposure was a double-edged sword. She had gained the power of public visibility, but with it came the weight of expectation. She was expected to be a symbol of resilience, a poster child for those who spoke out against racism. But Sofia wasn't sure if she could carry that weight. Every phone call, every message, every glance she received now felt heavy with judgment. She had stood up for herself, yes, but she had also made herself a target. As she continued to serve tables, the tension was palpable. The regular customers, who once smiled at her and engaged in casual conversation, now looked at her with uncertainty. Some offered polite smiles, others avoided eye contact altogether. Sofia knew why. The media had already framed the issue, painting her as the victim and Thomas as the villain. But the truth was much more complicated than that. The most significant shift came when Sofia was called into a meeting with Carl and Nancy, the HR manager at the restaurant. She was nervous as she sat across from them, her hands tightly clutching her apron. This was it. The moment she had been bracing for. "Sofia," Carl began, "we need to talk about your complaint. About how this whole situation is affecting the restaurant and the staff." Sofia nodded, her mind racing. She wasn't sure what they were expecting, what they wanted from her. But Carl's next words caught her off guard. "We need to know what you expect from us. We need to know how we can make things right. And we need you to understand that this is bigger than just your situation. The restaurant's reputation is on the line." Sofia's gaze hardened. "What do you mean, make things right?" she asked, her voice tight. "You can't just make it right with a few training sessions. You can't fix this with some half-hearted apology from Thomas. It's bigger than that." Carl shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't back down. "We're committed to making sure something like this doesn't happen again." Sofia didn't respond immediately. She had heard this before. The promises, the empty apologies. She had no faith that this would change anything. "You need to do more than just say you'll change," she replied firmly. "You need to prove it. You need to hold people like Thomas accountable. And you need to change the culture here. Because this isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's ever had to endure this, and it's time to fix it." Sofia stood up, her shoulders squared, and without waiting for their response, she walked out of the room. The uncertainty still lingered in the air, but one thing was clear: she wasn't backing down. The days following Sofia's confrontation with Carl were marked by a new kind of silence. Sofia had spoken her truth, and now, as she waited for the repercussions, she felt an unsettling stillness in the restaurant. It was the kind of silence that could only be bred by fear. Fear of the unknown, of change, of accountability. She had pushed the system into a corner, and now it was scrambling to figure out what to do next. Sofia wasn't naive. She knew that the powers at play weren't going to just roll over. The restaurant's management would likely try to smooth things over, wrap it all in a neat little bow, and move on as if nothing had happened. But she couldn't let them get away with that. Not after everything. Thomas, meanwhile, had descended into a state of limbo. The suspension from work was just the beginning. With his public image tarnished, he was now facing mounting pressure from both the company and the public. The apology was expected, of course, a scripted message that would be crafted by the PR department. But the problem was deeper than that. He couldn't undo the damage, not with a few well-chosen words. He sat alone in his apartment, the walls closing in on him. The weight of the public scrutiny pressed down on him with a suffocating force. He was being followed by paparazzi now. His name splashed across social media, every comment a reminder of his failure. He could almost hear Sofia's voice in his head. "It's bigger than that. You need to do more than just apologize." He had no idea how to fix it. He hadn't even known he was broken. In the days that followed, the media storm continued to rage, but Sofia held her ground. Her face was now familiar to people outside the restaurant. News outlets had picked up her story, and her name became synonymous with standing up against injustice, especially the subtle, systemic racism that often went unnoticed. But the attention came at a price. At work, things had only become more awkward. Some customers, eager to show their support, would tip her generously, compliment her courage, and even ask to take photos with her. Others, however, seemed less comfortable. The conversations shifted, becoming more cautious, more strained. Sofia knew what they were thinking. They were wondering what she had done, what she had exposed. They were silently judging her, and she didn't care anymore. Her co-workers were no better. Some of them were still in denial, pretending everything was fine, while others whispered behind her back. Lisa had been the only one to consistently check in, offering words of support and solidarity. But even Lisa was worried. Sofia could tell. Every time she asked about the state of things, Lisa's eyes would flicker nervously. There were rumors swirling that Carl might be preparing to fire Sofia. He was under pressure from corporate, from the media, from his higher-ups to keep things quiet. A public apology from Thomas and some sensitivity training for the staff would be the quickest way to bury the scandal. But Sofia wasn't about to let it go away. The tipping point came when Carl called her into his office again. He was polite but distant, his manner cool as he gestured for her to sit. "Sofia," he began, his voice clipped. "I understand that your complaint has caused some disruption, and while I commend your courage, we need to address the situation." Sofia braced herself. She knew what was coming. "I've spoken to the higher-ups, and we're working on a resolution," Carl continued. "But I have to be clear with you, we need this situation to quiet down. The restaurant's reputation is taking a hit, and the customers are starting to get uncomfortable. You need to put this behind you for everyone's sake." Sofia's jaw tightened. She had expected the pressure, but hearing it out loud, hearing Carl's attempt to justify the dismissal of her experience, made her blood boil. "You want me to put it behind me," she said, her voice steady but filled with resolve. "You want me to forget about the things that I've experienced and pretend like they don't matter? Like the way Thomas spoke to me, the way management has allowed this to continue?" Carl shifted uncomfortably. "I understand your frustration, but you have to understand the bigger picture. We can't afford to have this become a prolonged public issue. It's affecting our business." The words hit Sofia like a slap in the face. Business. It always came back to business. The bottom line. The customers. The money. None of it had ever been about her. It had always been about maintaining the status quo. "I'm not going to back down," Sofia said, standing up. Her voice was louder now, stronger. "Not for you. Not for anyone. I will not let you sweep this under the rug. Not this time." Carl's eyes flickered with annoyance, but he said nothing more. Sofia turned on her heel and walked out, the door slamming behind her with a finality that echoed in the empty hallway. Thomas's situation was becoming dire. His apology had been released to the press, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. The public backlash didn't just fizzle out. It grew stronger. The apology felt forced, insincere. The media crucified him for his behavior, for his privilege, for his complete lack of awareness about how his words had affected Sofia. But the worst part was the silent recognition he had come to. He had never understood what it meant to be held accountable, to face the consequences of his actions. Everywhere he went, people were talking about him. At the grocery store, in the coffee shop, even online. His name had become a symbol of all the things that were wrong with the world. He had been exposed not just as a man who had said a cruel thing, but as a product of a system that allowed him to get away with it. He was a reflection of everything that Sofia had fought against. For Sofia, the road ahead was uncertain. Her emotional toll had been immense. The isolation, the judgment, the weight of being thrust into the spotlight. But she wasn't backing down. She couldn't. Not when there was so much at stake. Thomas had been exposed, but so had the system. And Sofia wasn't going to let it go. Not now, not ever. She would fight not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than. The reckoning had begun, and there was no turning back. The days after Sofia's final confrontation with Carl felt like the calm after a storm. A fleeting moment of peace before the next wave would inevitably crash. But there was a shift in the air, something palpable and undeniable. Sofia knew that her life had changed forever. And, in a way, so had Thomas's. As the media storm raged on, the restaurant faced the inevitable fallout. The public outcry had only intensified after Sofia's bold stance. Articles, opinion pieces, and online discussions painted the situation as a microcosm of the broader racial issues that continued to plague society. The restaurant's reputation was teetering on the edge of disaster, with many patrons calling for boycotts and others demanding that real change be made. Inside the restaurant, things were quieter. Sofia could sense the shift in the staff dynamics. Some co-workers, once friendly but distant, now avoided her. They looked at her with a mixture of admiration, guilt, and fear. Others, especially the more outspoken ones, reached out in support, but Sofia knew that it wasn't the same. The delicate balance of professionalism had shifted, and no one knew how to walk the fine line anymore. Sofia had never wanted to become a symbol. She had just wanted to be treated with dignity. But here she was, standing at the center of something much larger than herself, and she wasn't sure how to navigate it. Thomas, on the other hand, was drowning. His carefully curated image, the one he had spent years building up in the corporate world, had crumbled into dust. His colleagues, who once regarded him with admiration or envy, now looked at him with judgment, disappointment, and silent reproach. He had become the poster child for everything wrong with privilege, for every misstep that had gone unchecked for far too long. His life, once defined by control and certainty, now felt unrecognizable. Every day felt like he was walking through a fog, not knowing which direction he was supposed to be heading in. He had tried to apologize to Sofia, tried to reach out, but she had never responded to his messages. He didn't expect her to, but the silence only deepened the chasm between them. At home, Thomas sat in front of his laptop, staring at the countless articles and social media threads that dissected his every move. His name had become synonymous with insensitivity, with entitlement. Every comment, every post, felt like another blow to his ego, another reminder of the damage he had done. He had tried to reach out to his boss, Carl, to get advice, but Carl had grown more distant as well. The company was handling the situation with kid gloves, trying to appease the public while doing as little as possible. Thomas was a liability now, an unfortunate scandal that the company would need to weather. But for the first time, Thomas felt completely alone. He couldn't escape the reality of what he had done. He couldn't run from the consequences of his own actions, no matter how much he wished he could. One evening, as Sofia sat in her apartment, flipping through the pages of a book she hadn't been able to focus on for weeks, her phone buzzed. It was an email from a local activist group she had been quietly following for months. The subject line was simple, but it hit her like a bolt of lightning. "We'd love to hear your story." She had never expected this. She had never even thought about getting involved in activism beyond her personal experience at the restaurant. But now, with everything that had happened, she saw the opportunity to use her voice. Not just for her own healing, but for the healing of others who had experienced the same injustices. She took a deep breath and, without overthinking it, replied. Over the next few weeks, things began to settle into an unsettling new normal. Sofia found herself meeting with various groups, speaking at local events about the experiences of marginalized workers and the systemic forces that enable discrimination. Her voice became a beacon for those who had long been silent. She was offered interviews with local news outlets, then national ones, and with each step, the weight of her own journey became more and more evident. She wasn't just telling her story, she was helping others find the courage to tell theirs. It wasn't always easy. She had been asked questions that made her uncomfortable, pushed into uncomfortable spaces that required her to relive her pain. But in those moments, Sofia found clarity. She had been broken, yes, but she had also been rebuilt, stronger and more resolute than ever. The fire inside her burned bright. And it was no longer just about righting the wrongs of one man, one restaurant. It was about something much bigger. The restaurant, meanwhile, had tried to move forward with its standard damage control tactics. More training, a stronger statement, an apology from Thomas. But nothing seemed to stick. The damage had been done, and now the company had to grapple with the fact that they couldn't easily erase the scar Sofia had left. No apology could undo the centuries of deep-seated bias that had fueled Thomas's words or his actions. No amount of PR could smooth over the silence that had allowed it to continue. Sofia knew this was only the beginning. As much as she had hoped for change, she knew that real transformation took time. It was a slow, arduous process, one that demanded more than just surface-level fixes. But for the first time in a long time, she felt optimistic. She wasn't fighting alone. The people who had once been afraid to speak out were now gathering, uniting, rallying behind a cause bigger than themselves. And then, one day, as Sofia stood in front of a crowd at a rally, speaking about her experience, she felt the weight of it all. The audience hung on every word, their faces filled with both sadness and hope. She had become the voice of many, and it wasn't lost on her that her own healing had been tied to the healing of others. Thomas, on the other hand, was left to pick up the pieces of his own life. The company had quietly let him go, offering him a severance package and a non-disclosure agreement. It was clear they wanted him to fade into the background, to move on and forget what had happened. But Thomas couldn't forget. He couldn't undo the damage. The power he had once wielded so effortlessly had been stripped away. Now he was just another name in the headlines, another cautionary tale of unchecked privilege. He knew that his journey was far from over. Redemption, if it was even possible, would take years. But for the first time in his life, Thomas had begun to understand something that had always eluded him: true accountability. And as he watched the rally on the news, as Sofia's words echoed through the speakers, he realized that he had been part of the problem. His life had changed forever, and now he would have to live with the consequences. Sofia stood on the stage, her heart racing, but her voice steady. She had fought for her truth, for her dignity, and now she was fighting for all of them, for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for all of those who had been silenced, ignored, and oppressed. This was just the beginning. Sofia's life, for better or worse, had been irrevocably altered. The small ripple she had created with her initial complaint had turned into a tidal wave, one that not only rocked the restaurant but also reverberated through the very foundation of her own existence. She had become a symbol, a voice in a larger, louder conversation, but it wasn't without its toll. She had been thrust into the spotlight in ways she never imagined. The media, while at first focused on her brave stand against an abusive culture, soon turned their attention to the aftermath, the personal costs. She had become a beacon for justice, but she had also become a target. Every interview, every speech, every public appearance felt like an emotional excavation. The faces she saw in the crowd when she spoke at rallies, those familiar with her pain, gave her strength. But there were still times, late at night, when the weight of it all felt like too much to bear. The lonely nights when she lay awake, questioning if she was truly making a difference, or if this was just another fleeting wave of media attention. She had survived the onslaught of public attention, but the deeper battle was still unfolding inside her. Her friends, Lisa especially, continued to support her, but Sofia knew that the emotional scars of what she had endured would take far longer to heal. She often found herself wondering, was the fight worth the price? Would she ever return to the quiet, simple life she once led? Still, despite the toll, Sofia remained resolute. There was no turning back now. She couldn't abandon the cause. Not when she had already come this far. Meanwhile, Thomas was drowning in the fallout of his own actions. The suspension had given him time to reflect, but it hadn't given him any clarity. The severance package from the company had been generous, but it felt like a hollow gesture. The company, eager to move on, had allowed him to exit with minimal fanfare, but the media's scrutiny didn't fade. The internet had a long memory. Everywhere he went, he was met with the same cold stares and whispered conversations. People didn't want to hear his side anymore. His apology, which had been crafted with the help of public relations experts, seemed insincere to everyone. They saw it for what it was, a product of a system that had never truly held him accountable. He could no longer hide behind his polished image. The privilege he had once taken for granted was now a glaring reminder of everything he had failed to see. The hardest part, however, was that he could no longer ignore the reality of the situation. The public response had been swift and unforgiving, but more importantly, it had been deserved. He had seen the conversations in the news, the commentary on race, power, and the importance of accountability. He could no longer dismiss the issue as something overblown or a joke as he had done before. He had done harm, and now he had to reckon with it. Thomas's attempt to apologize to Sofia had been met with cold silence. She hadn't even acknowledged his attempts to reach out. And honestly, he couldn't blame her. He had been too blind, too arrogant, to see the impact of his words until it was too late. Now the damage was irreversible. The hardest part was not knowing what came next. What was his redemption? Was there any way to regain what he had lost? He had spent his entire career climbing the corporate ladder, building a life based on the illusion of control, only to watch it all crumble in a matter of weeks. And in the silence that followed, the truth lingered unspoken. He had failed. Sofia stood in front of the mirror one evening, looking at her reflection. It wasn't the first time she had done so, but tonight felt different. The girl who had walked into that restaurant months ago, the girl who had quietly accepted the daily slights and humiliations, felt far away. She was no longer that person, not even close. She had taken the pain and used it as fuel, as a catalyst for something bigger than herself. But in the quiet of the moment, standing alone in her apartment, she realized that she hadn't truly allowed herself to grieve. The emotional toll, the weight of the relentless public scrutiny, the isolation, it had all taken more than she had let on. She had been so focused on the fight that she hadn't stopped to ask herself, "What about me?" Sofia's phone buzzed on the counter, breaking her reverie. It was a message from Lisa. "Sofia, there's something I think you need to know." The message wasn't much, but something about it made Sofia's heart race. She quickly typed a response, asking Lisa what she meant. A moment later, Lisa replied, "Thomas has requested a meeting with you. He wants to apologize in person." Sofia froze. The anger she had felt for so long, the resentment that had simmered since that night, flared to life again. How dare he? How could he, after everything? After everything he had put her through. But as quickly as the anger had flared, it was followed by an unexpected wave of exhaustion. She didn't want to hear his apology. She didn't want to relive the pain. She didn't want to sit across from him and hear the hollow words that would pour out of his mouth. But there was also something else, something she couldn't ignore. The weight of the unresolved issue between them had been hanging over her. She had never gotten the closure she needed. And perhaps this was the moment. Not for him, but for her. Sofia agreed to the meeting, setting a time for the following day. The next morning, she found herself standing outside a small cafe in the city, waiting for Thomas to arrive. She felt no excitement, no anticipation, just a quiet resolve. When he walked through the door, he looked different. The confident, self-assured man she had once seen at the restaurant was gone. In his place stood a man broken by his own actions, wearing the weight of his past mistakes on his shoulders. "Hello, Sofia," he said quietly, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me." She nodded but said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," Thomas began, his words slow, measured. "And I don't expect it. I've spent so much of my life avoiding the truth about who I am and what I've done. But I see it now. I see everything, how I hurt you, how I hurt so many people just by being who I am. I've been part of the problem, and I can't take that back." Sofia looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the remorse in his eyes, but it wasn't enough. She didn't need his apology to heal. She didn't need his acknowledgement of his mistakes to find peace. But she did need to hear him say it. For her own closure. "I can't change what happened," he continued, "but I will do everything I can to make things right. To be better. To learn. And I know that won't fix everything, but I have to try." Sofia sat back, her heart heavy but somehow lighter at the same time. She didn't offer him forgiveness, but she didn't reject him either. She was done with the anger. She was done with the fight. "I don't need your redemption," Sofia said softly. "What I need is for you to learn. To see people like me for who we really are, not as something to be dismissed or belittled. I don't need an apology. I need you to use your privilege to make a difference." Thomas nodded, the weight of her words settling into him. He couldn't promise her anything. But as he sat across from her, he understood for the first time that true redemption wasn't about getting a second chance. It was about living in the consequences of your actions and striving to be better because of them. Sofia stood on the stage, the bright lights of the rally warming her face as the crowd in front of her buzzed with anticipation. She had spoken at rallies before, but this felt different. This wasn't just another speech for her anymore. This was the culmination of everything she had been through, everything she had fought for. The weight of it settled deep in her chest as she adjusted the microphone and looked out into the sea of faces before her. The crowd had grown since the first time she'd stood here, the voices swelling with support, with understanding. They were here for her, yes, but they were also here for the cause, for the acknowledgement of a painful, pervasive reality that had been ignored for far too long. This wasn't just about one man or one incident. This was about every person who had ever felt silenced, every person who had been pushed to the edges of society by systems they had no power over. She took a deep breath and began. "Thank you all for being here today." Sofia's voice rang out, steady and clear. "This fight isn't just mine. It's ours. All of us. It's about every person who has been made to feel less than. It's about every word spoken in haste, every joke passed off as harmless, every insult hidden behind a smile." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. The crowd was hanging on every word. They knew this was not just another speech. This was a call to action. "Racism doesn't live in one person or one incident," she continued. "It's woven into the fabric of our institutions, our workplaces, our homes. It's the silence when we choose not to speak up, the inaction when we could make a difference. We need to stop pretending it's something that happens over there, somewhere out of sight, somewhere other. It's here. It's in the everyday. And if we're going to change, if we're going to make this world a better place for everyone, it has to start now." A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd. Sofia could see their faces, their eyes, reflecting the same fire she had felt all those months ago when she had first stood up to Thomas. The fight wasn't easy, and the path wasn't clear, but this was the beginning. The beginning of something bigger than herself. After the rally, Sofia made her way through the crowd, shaking hands, accepting hugs from familiar faces, her heart swelling with pride and relief. She had made it through the hardest part. The fear had started to fade, replaced by a sense of purpose she had never known. She had found her voice, and with it, she had inspired others to find theirs. There was power in that. There was strength in knowing you weren't alone, that the fight for justice didn't rest on just one person's shoulders. It was a collective effort. As Sofia stepped off the stage, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, half expecting another message from Lisa or an email from one of the activists she had been working with. But it wasn't. The message was from Thomas. "Sofia, I wanted to reach out again. I understand if you never want to speak to me again, but I just want to say that I'm still trying to learn. I don't expect forgiveness. But I do hope one day you'll see the change in me. You made me realize what I had been blind to. You've changed my life. I'm sorry for everything." Sofia read the message twice, the words sinking in. She didn't know how to respond, if she should even respond. She had given him the opportunity for closure, for himself. And now it felt like the chapter between them was finally, definitively closing. She had come to terms with everything that had happened, with the mistakes he had made, with the consequences of his actions. But forgiveness was a different story. She hadn't responded to him the last time he reached out, and she had no intention of doing so now. The apology wasn't for her. It wasn't something she needed to hear. She had found peace, not in his words, but in her own ability to move forward, in her own strength. Instead of replying, she placed the phone back in her pocket, took a deep breath, and stepped into the cool night air. There was still work to do, still change to be made, but tonight she could rest. She had done what she set out to do. The following weeks were filled with continued public appearances, more interviews, and endless conversations with activists and advocates who shared her passion. Sofia's voice became more prominent, and with it, the movement she had helped ignite. But as much as she had given to the cause, there was a growing understanding that she couldn't do it alone. Sofia had learned the hard way that true change didn't come from one person speaking up. It came from a collective effort, from the grassroots to the institutions, from the quiet moments of defiance to the loud, rallying cries for justice. And now, with the public spotlight still on her, she felt ready to take the next step. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the movement she was part of, a movement that would continue long after the headlines faded. One morning, Sofia sat down with Lisa over coffee, both of them reflecting on how far they had come. Lisa, who had been there from the beginning, had become an integral part of the work Sofia was doing. They had built something together, something that couldn't be torn down by the passing of time or the shifting tides of public opinion. "I think we're just getting started," Sofia said, her voice filled with conviction. "There's so much more to be done. And I know this movement isn't going to be perfect, but it has to happen." Lisa smiled, a quiet pride in her eyes. "I'm with you. Every step of the way." Sofia nodded, feeling the weight of the journey ahead, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. As for Thomas, his journey was still in its infancy. The months following his departure from the company had been a blur of self-reflection, introspection, and a desire to become better, not for anyone else but for himself. He had realized, too late, that change couldn't be achieved by words alone. It had to come from within, from an honest reckoning with the privileges he had taken for granted and the systemic forces that had allowed him to remain blind to the experiences of others. He had started attending support groups, reading books, and listening to podcasts on racial justice. It was a slow and often painful process, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was truly learning. One day, Thomas found himself at another rally, this time in a quiet corner of the park, watching Sofia speak once again. He had no intention of approaching her, no intention of asking for her forgiveness, but he knew that he had to witness the impact of her work. She had done what he never could, what he never had the courage to do. As she spoke, her words echoed through the crowd, sharp and unrelenting but filled with hope. And in that moment, Thomas understood something profound. Redemption wasn't about fixing the past. It was about making sure the future was different. The fight was far from over, but as Sofia stood there, watching the crowd respond, she realized that she was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for the generations to come. She was fighting for a world where her voice wasn't an anomaly, but a norm. And that, she knew, was a fight worth winning.